Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I call this December 18th, 2020 meeting of the Ncua Board to order. I want to note for the record that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, today's meeting is open to the public via a live webcast only. The public may access the meeting by visiting the agency's homepage and clicking on the provided webcast link. I'd also like to note that all participants in today's webcast meeting are participating remotely. If we experience any technical difficulties, please, I ask for your patience. The first item on our agenda today is Final Rule, Part 701, Annual Operating Fee Assessment. Staff presenting, Jim Holm, Supervisory Budget Analyst, Office of the Chief Financial Officer, Ian Marina, Associate General Counsel, and John Brolin, Senior Staff Attorney from the Office of General Counsel. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Chairman Hood and board members Harper and Hauptman. This is Jim Holm, the Supervisory Budget Analyst in the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. At its July 2020 meeting, the board issued a proposed rule to amend the NCUA's regulation governing assessment of an annual operating fee to federal credit unions, or FCUs. For purposes of calculating the annual operating fee, the proposed amendments would have 1. Excluded from total assets any loan an FCU reports under the Small Business Administration's Paycheck Protection Program or similar future programs approved for exclusion by the NCUA Board. 2. Deleted from the current regulation references to the Credit Union System Investment Program and the Credit Union Homeowners Affordability Relief Program, both of which no longer exist. And 3. Revise the period used for the calculation of an FCU's total assets as the basis for charging the operating fee. Currently, total assets are calculated using the FCU's December 31st call report of the preceding year. Under the proposal, total assets would be calculated as the average total assets reported on the FCU's previous 4 call reports available at the time the NCUA Board approves the agency's budget for the upcoming year, adjusted for any excludable programs as determined by the Board. Finally, the proposal would have made some minor technical and conforming changes. The NCUA received 9 comment letters about the proposed rule. In general, all of the letters received from commenters, 2 of which were from credit union trade associations and 7 of which were from credit union leagues, expressed broad support for the proposal. A few of the commenters raised issues for the NCUA's consideration, which I will now discuss in more detail. In response to the proposal to exclude PPP loans from total assets for purposes of computing the operating fee, all 9 of the commenters stated that they support this change and agreed with the NCUA's rationale for it. Similarly, in response to the proposal to delete references to the no longer existent Credit Union System Investment Program, or CU-SIP, and the Credit Union Homeowners Affordability Relief Program, or CU-HARP, none of the commenters raised any objection. In response to the proposal to use the average total assets from FCU's 4 most recent call reports as the basis for calculating operating fees, all 9 commenters stated that they support this change and generally agreed with the NCUA's rationale for it. The board proposed to use an average of total assets because it believed that doing so will reduce the effect of seasonal fluctuation in the total assets of FCUs and would provide more certainty to FCUs about their operating fee charges for the forthcoming year. The change to a 4-quarter average of reported assets would also reduce the risk that the NCUA could collect less in operating fee revenue than it requires if actual assets reported in FCU's December call reports were below the asset growth assumption used to set the operating fee rates in the budget. While all of the commenters supported this change, 4 of the commenters did ask that the NCUA also regularly review the effects of the change to ensure that it does not cause any unintended consequences. Although beyond the scope of this proposal, one commenter suggested that the NCUA further amend the operating fee regulation to treat mergers into and conversions with federally insured state chartered credit unions, or FISCUs, differently. This commenter stated that while the rule bars fee refunds when an FCU converts to or merges into a FISCU, the NCUA should reconsider this issue since the resulting credit union SIF deposit will reflect the merger, unlike a combination with an entity that is not SIF insured, and the resulting entity would no longer be an FCU. The commenter suggested that the NCUA provide pro rata fee refunds if an FCU converts to or merges into a FISCU. In response to the comment suggesting that the NCUA regularly review the impact of using the average of total assets reported in the 4 consecutive quarters as the basis for computing the operating fee, it is important to note that the NCUA reviews all of its existing regulations every 3 years. The changes made by this final rule will be regularly reviewed as part of that process, and the credit union industry and the public will be given a regular opportunity to raise any concerns that may arise. In response to the comment suggesting that the NCUA issue a pro rata fee refund to an FCU that converts to or merges into a FISCU, it is important to note that the operating fees charged to FCUs are based on a detailed workload projection of the agency's examination program, which is used to inform the agency's annual budget formulation and calculation of operating fee collections. The agency generally does not have insight into the future merger or charter conversion plans of a given FCU, and therefore must base its workload estimates on the population of FCUs that exist in the year before the budget is set and the fee is calculated. If the NCUA were to issue pro rata fee refunds to FCUs that subsequently merge with or convert to a FISCU, it would face continuing unfunded liabilities for staff salaries and associated expenses that could not be recouped from other sources, since the operating fee is billed only once annually. Similarly, the OTR share of the annual operating budget is determined in part based on the relative distribution of projected workload between FCUs and FISCUs in the year before the OTR is applied to actual operating expenses. Although the NCUA's actual workload may be marginally reduced if a FCU converts to or merges with a FISCU, such a change cannot be retroactively applied to the OTR used in a given year. The final rule also makes some technical changes to the operating fee rule. Given the potential for additional programs similar to the PPP to arise in the near future or as a result of a future economic crisis, the board proposed adding regulatory language that would allow for the exclusion of assets in the future under similar economic recovery programs, but without requiring a reference to the specific program name in the regulation text. Under the proposed new language, the board anticipated making exclusions of similar future programs by issuing an order, which could be published in a letter to FCUs or a similar notice. None of the commenters objected to the new language, and 8 of the commenters stated that they supported including the general language allowing for the exclusion of such programs as approved by the board. One of the commenters suggested that the NCUA also include provisions to exclude assets related to programs that provide relief during nationwide and regional crises. For example, natural disaster declarations and associated Small Business Administration disaster lending authorized as the result of hurricanes or other natural disasters. It is beyond the scope of the current proposal to incorporate disaster relief lending programs into the operating fee rule. As part of its next cyclical review of the operating fee rule, however, the NCUA can evaluate the feasibility and impact of such an exclusion. As a result of the broadly supportive comments about the draft operating fee rule, staff recommend that the board adopt the rule without revision. The rule will take effect 30 days after it is published in the Federal Register. This concludes my remarks about the operating fee rule, and my colleagues and I are happy to answer any questions you may now have. Thank you, and back to you, Chairman Hood.
Great. Thank you, Jim, for that very in-depth presentation. I appreciate the hard work that went into reviewing the draft comments and developing the final proposal, both in the CFO's office as well as our Office of General Counsel. The Ncua board was briefed at the July board meeting on proposed regulatory changes to the calculation of the operating fee, and the board approved the publication of the draft rule. Having reviewed public comments, we now consider the final rule. I'd like to take this time to thank the stakeholders. In response to this draft rule, the agency received 9 comment letters, as you referenced, Jim, from the credit union industry. As always, I know the staff and the board carefully review and consider those comments before making final decisions. I now have a few questions. My first question is about the impact of this rule and the Ncra budget. Later in today's agenda, we will take up consideration of the 2021-2022 budget. What impact would any of these changes have on the budget, if at all?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. So strictly speaking, these changes would have no impact on the approach the agency uses to formulate its budget, because when we put the budget together, we work with the NCUA's offices to determine the resources that they need to carry out the agency's work. And once we determine the total amount for the annual budget, we then apply the fee to that budgeted amount and determine how to divvy up the costs across the entire population of federal credit unions. In order to illustrate how these changes affect, or how the changes that the board has proposed affect the operating fee that will be charged to federal credit unions, however, in the budget we published a comparative table that shows the fee rates under the current methodology and then the proposed rules and methodologies that you are considering today. So in the final recommended budget, which I believe is the next item on the agenda for today's board meeting, the operating fee calculation table shows how under the current rule and methodology, the operating fee would decrease by 17.9%, and then compared to the new rule and methodology, the decrease would actually be 19.6%. So that difference is 170 basis points, and is a result of the changes that we are discussing right now.
Great.
Thank you. That's the conclusion of my answer.
Great, Jim. Thank you. You also mentioned in your presentation that the draft notice of rulemaking included the provision that would exclude PPP loans from operating fee calculations, and I want you to know that is a change that I clearly will be supporting. I was very pleased. I know I referenced this in yesterday's board meeting. I was very pleased with the credit unions that all participated in the PPP program. I still find it just hard to believe that over 171,000 loans were originated by credit unions for an aggregate amount of about $8.4 billion. And most impressive was that those loans had an average size of $49,000, getting directly into the hands of those small Main Street businesses. Jim, was there any objection to this specific change about the PPP loans, and do you know what kind of an impact this might have on the calculation of the operating fee?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. And as you mentioned, the comments that we received from the organizations that represent the credit union industry were something we reviewed very closely. All of the letters that we received support the proposal to exclude the PPP loans from the operating fee rule. To the second part of your question about how that exclusion would change the way that we compute the operating fee rule, we did do an analysis to examine how that volume that you mentioned and dollar amount of the PPP loans would change our operating fee calculation. And the first step in that calculation is to review and compute the growth over the last year of the credit union system. And so if we were to include PPP loans in that growth calculation, we would compute a system growth of 12.30% over the past year instead of a 12.05% growth excluding the PPP loans. So those PPP loans represent a 25 basis point difference in the growth calculation. The second step for the operating fee calculation is to apply that level of system growth to the operating fee schedule. And if we were to include PPP loans, a higher level of system growth would generate a larger reduction in the 2021 operating fee, since the fee itself is a proportional distribution of the agency's budget across the base of the total assets within the federal credit union community. So therefore, if the PPP loans were included in calculating that operating fee adjustment, the operating fee would decrease in 2021 by 19.64% instead of the 19.6% difference, or excuse me, instead of the 19.6% reduction that we compute when excluding the PPP loans. That's a difference of 4 basis points. The one thing that I do think is important to point out, however, is that although there was widespread participation in the PPP program, not every credit union, or excuse me, not every federal credit union, which are the credit unions that pay operating fees, not every federal credit union actually made PPP loans and therefore reported them in their call reports. So even though the operating fee might decrease by a marginally larger amount if the PPP loans were included in the calculation, the rates that would be charged to individual credit unions would be less equitably distributed were the PPP loans to be included. That is to say, credit unions that issued PPP loans would be in some ways financially penalized by having to pay more in operating fees compared to credit unions that did not participate in the PPP program, all other things being equal. As we explain in the final fee rule, the PPP loans are fully guaranteed by the federal government, and therefore they create no additional risk to a credit union's balance sheet. So as a result, we believe that the credit union's participation in the PPP program should have little to no impact on the examination workload, and for that reason, we recommend excluding the PPP loans from the operating fee as detailed in the rule that you have before you today. So that concludes my answer.
Great, and thank you for such a really robust response. That really is illuminating. One final question. You also mentioned that considering the potential for additional programs similar to the PPP that could arise in the near future or as a result of future economic crises, language has been added to allow for the exclusion of assets in the future under similar programs without requiring a reference to the specific program in the regulation. What comments did we get about how this might be applied, Jim?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. You are correct that the rule that is before you would establish authority for the board to exempt other economic recovery programs from the operating fee calculations through a notice rather than through a revision to the regulatory text. And thankfully, or in response, none of the commenters opposed this flexibility. We believe, and this is the reason why it's proposed in this way, that it is important for the board to have the flexibility because, as we know, Congress is able to enact such support and recovery programs relatively quickly, and the regulatory revision process can sometimes be slower than the speed at which the rest of the world moves. So just for example, as you mentioned, the credit unions made a substantial amount of PPP loans according to the September call report, but just in comparison for our regulatory revisions to the operating fee rule and the exclusion of the PPPs, we've been working since July to exclude these loans technically through the public notice period. So we want to ensure that the board is able to react as quickly as possible to any sort of late-breaking economic recovery or support programs, and therefore we think that it is an appropriate way to structure this final rule text. As far as the other part of your question about how we may apply this in the future, as I discussed in my presentation, one of the commenters suggested that we as an agency should consider excluding other federally guaranteed loans, such as the Small Business Administration Disaster Loan Program, which are loans that can be authorized in the wake of a natural disaster, like a hurricane or a flood or a tornado. As part of the final rule, we recommend and commit to a further analysis of this suggestion, which we intend to carry out after we collect some data about how credit unions participate in these SBA disaster loan programs. So that concludes my response to your question, sir.
Great. Thank you, Jim. And I have no further questions. I'd now like to recognize Board Member Harper. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Jim, Ian, and JB, for your hard work on this final rule to modify how we calculate the annual operating fee that the NCUA assesses federal credit unions. Earlier this year, the NCUA board sensibly excluded loans made through the Paycheck Protection Program from the determination of a credit union's net worth ratio. We, however, did not make changes to our other regulatory requirements or administrative calculations that depend on a credit union's total assets. As the Paycheck Protection Program advances an important public policy goal, we should exclude such loans from the calculation of the operating fee. Without such a change, a federal credit union's Paycheck Protection Program loans could subject the lender to a higher operating fee. These loans are meant to help Main Street small businesses and their employees to withstand the economic fallout related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and there is a real possibility that Congress will authorize more funding for a new more Paycheck Protection Program loans before the end of the year. We do not want to impose a burden on credit unions for participating in the Small Business Administration's program or create a disincentive to participate going forward. Further, excluding all reported Paycheck Protection Program loans when determining total assets will ensure that federal credit unions that do not pledge such loans to the Federal Reserve Board's liquidity facility are treated consistently with those federal credit unions that do. Additionally, I fully agree with the decision to use the 4-quarter average of total assets when calculating the operating fee. This methodology is more equitable overall because it can account for seasonal share account fluctuations that some credit unions experience. In sum, I will support this final rule on credit union operating fees. Mr. Chairman, I have no questions and no further comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harper. I now would like to recognize Board Member Hoffman. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to concur with the statements made by yourself and Board Member Harper. I will be supporting it as well. It is definitely the right thing to do. It also feels especially pertinent because there may be a fresh batch of $300 billion appropriated for brand new PPP loans. Although waking up this morning felt like Groundhog Day. You know, I see the news and Congress is still working on it, so it's not done at all. May never happen. But if it does, the gentleman presenting, Mr. Holm, he is definitely right about fast-moving and late-breaking because the COVID relief bills that Congress has done, one thing about them, they all take effect immediately. When they cut a deal, it happens quick. If we on Monday, if they strike this deal, that means, you know, Tuesday morning, there will be people applying and filling out that form, which, as we know, is a 2-page form, and millions of dollars could start flowing out, you know, within hours of House Senate passage and the president's signature, all of which would have probably happened on the same day. Some of that money will go out in 2020, covered by the prior arrangements the board made, and some of that may go out the door in year 2021. I feel it's appropriate to recognize what the credit union industry did during a very dark hour for this country during the early days of the pandemic. Board Member Harper alerted me yesterday. He said the smallest loan, PPP loan he heard of was about $650, which means the 5% fee the credit union earned on it was about $30. They did all that work for $30. And I think we all heard of stories and anecdotes of credit union employees working in shifts, 24 hours, you know, all through the night to get all of the applications and then the forgiveness forms submitted. And that is a credit to the folks working in credit unions across the country. It's also a credit to the work that this board did earlier in the year when I was not here to provide that treatment that allowed that relief to get through. And so I would concur with the statements earlier, and I will be supporting as well. No further questions, no further comments.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Haltman. And if I could just add even additional color around the credit union engagement with the PPP program, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the great work that our minority depository institutions did with the program. It was our MDIs that were able to make 6,839 loans for an aggregate of about $388 million. And again, their average loan size was about $57,000. I especially want to note the one particular credit union there in Mississippi that made 1,000 PPP loans. So again, it was a great program, and it really did help with the economy and keeping the small businesses safe and intact. With that being said, I'd now like to ask, is there a motion?
There is. This is Board Member Harper. I move that the Board approve Final Rule, Part 701 of NCUA's Rules and Regulations as attached to the Board Action Memorandum.
Is there a second to the motion?
This is Board Member Hauptman. I second the motion.
There is a sufficient second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and let the record show the motion passed 3-0. Thank you. The second item on today's agenda is NCUA's 2021-2022 budget. Staff presenting Eugene Shead, Chief Financial Officer. Welcome and good morning, Eugene.
Good morning, Chairman Hood, Board Member Harper, and Board Member Hauptman. I'm here to present for your approval the 2021-2022 budgets. Pursuant to the Federal Credit Union Act, it is the Board's responsibility to determine the resources necessary to carry out NCUA's responsibilities under the Act. The Board is authorized to expend such funds and perform such other functions or acts as it deems necessary or appropriate in accordance with the rules, regulations, or policies it establishes. The NCUA published a draft budget to its website and in the Federal Register on November 19th, and the Board had an open budget meeting on December 2nd. Comments were accepted through December 11th, 2020. The NCUA received several written comments. The draft budget has been updated to address many of these comments, some of which I will refer to in my presentation. The Board Action Memorandum contains a more comprehensive response to the comments that the agency received. The revised combined budgets for 2021 total $341.3 million. This consists of the operating budget of $314.6 million and 1,187 full-time equivalent, the capital budget of $18.8 million, and the share insurance fund administrative budget of $8 million and 5 FTE. The funding proposed in the three budgets decrease from the 2020 budgets by 1.7%. And compared to the draft version of the budgets published in the Federal Register, these budgets are reduced by $1.1 million in 2021. The 2021 draft operating budget was reduced by $1 million, which is now 0.4% lower than the 2020 operating budget. The 2021 travel expenses budget was reduced by an additional 10.1%, or $1.2 million, as compared to the draft budget, because the agency now expects lessons learned during the pandemic about remote and off-site work to lower travel needs. Funding for one of the two new executive positions proposed in the budget will support financial technology and access, and one additional position has been added to support this function. A second executive position proposed in the draft budget is in anticipation of a new full-time president for the Central Liquidity Facility. And $300,000 has been added to develop and implement a mechanism, such as an examination survey, to get feedback from credit unions on their interactions with the agency. The agency received a comment on the draft budget to, quote, improve accountability and reduce examinations burden by adopting a formal feedback mechanism, unquote. The 2022 draft operating budget estimates were adjusted downwards by $24.9 million to reflect continued lower levels of employee travel in 2022, a return to NCUA's more typical vacancy rate amongst its career staff, and a reclassification of a portion of the 2022 contracted services budget into the 2022 capital budget. The 2021 capital budget is unchanged from the draft version and remains at $18.8 million. The 2022 capital budget was increased $4.3 million as compared to the draft budget. And finally, the funding levels in the 2021 and 2022 draft share insurance fund administrative budget were reduced by $125,000 to $8 million to reflect the actual cost of support contracts for the NCUA's Guaranteed Notes program. Approximately $10.4 million in funding for travel in 2020 will not be spent before the end of this current year and is proposed to be used as follows. $3.7 million to retire the central office note. The remaining balances of unspent 2020 travel budgets would be used in 2021 to offset travel costs and costs related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, access to funds already provided by the board for the central office renovations would be extended to the end of 2021. In approving the budget, the NCUA board is asked to approve the following provisions. First, to be better positioned to respond to the uncertainties associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, the NCUA board is asked to delegate to the executive director temporary hiring authority of up to 30 individuals who have retired from the federal service into credit union examiner positions, as further described in the board action memorandum. Funding for these positions would come from any residual 2020 operating budget balances unspent in 2020 and not otherwise already repurposed by the board. The board action memorandum clarifies that the additional Consumer Compliance Program Officer position to be added to the Office of Consumer Financial Protection in 2021 is intended to provide an additional resource to aid in developing a proposal to enhance consumer compliance examination procedures for the largest credit unions that are not primarily examined for consumer financial protection by the CFPB, that the director of OCFP will deliver a report to the board, and that any changes to the NCUA's examination and supervision procedures that are not routine must be approved by the board. Commenters expressed support for the NCUA's Access Initiative and encouraged the agency to ensure that the Office of Credit Union Resource and Expansion has sufficient resources. The 2021 budget includes $250,000 for support of the Access Initiative and provides sufficient resources to carry out NCUA's chartering responsibilities. Two commenters encouraged the NCUA board to continue to identify cost savings opportunities by conducting more virtual examinations, with one of those commenters adding that the budget should not be use unspent travel funds in 2020 to pay for travel in 2021, but instead apply an across-the-board reduction to the agency's travel budgets. As I've noted, in revising the proposed budget, additional travel savings have been factored into both the 2021 and 2022 budgets. Commenters also requested that the NCUA continue to find ways to reduce its capital budget as it rolls out merit, and to keep credit unions informed of the progress of the merit rollout. The NCUA will provide user guides and training materials to assist in this transition, as further described in the board action memorandum. One commenter noted that since state regulators and state-chartered credit unions alone will bear the capital cost for computers and computer software going forward, The SIF should carry a smaller percentage of the NCOA's computer and other capital charges than the NCOA allocates to its role as the federal chartering authority. To clarify the NCOA's approach for capital costs, the SIF administrative budget only covers the cost for computers and other technology provided directly to state supervisory authorities, whereas the capital budget covers agency-wide capital expenditures. One commenter noted that it can be difficult to identify changes the NCOA makes in its budgets based on this public input. I'll note that each budget justification presented to the board for consideration is accompanied by a detailed board action memorandum which summarizes the agency's response to public comments on the draft budget. Other comments received from the public relate to NCOA's operations or the Share Insurance Fund, and these comments will be sent to the appropriate NCOA offices that manage those issues for their consideration. The NCOA budget is funded primarily through fees paid by federal credit unions and transfers from the Share Insurance Fund using the overhead transfer rate, or OTR. The annual budget is developed for board review and approval. The approved methodologies for calculating the OTR and the operating fee are applied to determine the amounts of the budget that each will finance. Also on the agenda for this board meeting are changes to the operating fee regulation and methodology, which help to further explain how the NCOA funds its operating and capital budgets. To promote transparency about how the NCOA finances its programs, the budget justification document includes a discussion of the methodologies for calculating the OTR and on the current and proposed methodologies for calculating the operating fee. The estimates and calculations in the budget and in the BAM are predicated on the revisions as proposed by the agency and are subject to final board approval. The OTR estimate presented in the updated budget justification has not changed. The final 2021 overhead transfer rate remains at 62.3%. This is an increase of 100 basis points from the 61.3% rate calculated for the 2020 budget. The residual 37.7% of the 2021 budget will be collected through the operating fee. Based on the revised operating fee methodology expected to take effect in 2021, the operating fee charged to federal credit unions will decrease 19.6% as compared to 2020 and is a 19 basis point reduction from the estimate provided in the draft budget in November. As shown in the updated budget, federal credit unions cover 69% of the cost of NCOA's operations, while federally insured state-chartered credit unions pay 31%. The federal credit unions with assets less than $1 million are not assessed an operating fee. For federal credit unions with assets greater than $1 million, the NCOA uses a three-tiered scale to compute the fees charged, also known as the assessment scale. The dividing points on the assessment scale are adjusted upwards on an annual basis by the computed rate of asset growth. The dividing points are indexed annually by asset growth to preserve the same relative relationship of the scale to the applicable asset base. This concludes my presentation. I recommend the NCOA Board approve the recommended actions as outlined in the Board Action Memorandum, and I will be happy to answer any questions the Board has. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Eugene, for your very thorough update on the NCOA budget. Please know that I greatly appreciate the hard work and diligence by staff in putting together a document such as this, and for the work that goes into reviewing the comments and feedback and developing the revised budget that you just presented this morning. This, I can assure everyone who's joining us today, has truly been an iterative process. The NCRA Board heard a presentation from Eugene as well as 3 stakeholder groups at our annual public budget briefing on December 2nd, 2020. This process is vitally important for transparency and accountability to the credit union system because funding for the NCRA's operations comes from fees and assessments paid directly by the credit union industry. The process is valuable for the feedback that it provides to us as we consider NCUA's plans and budgets for the upcoming year. To repeat one of the stakeholder comments we heard earlier this month, and I quote, "The NCUA is the only FIREA agency that publishes a detailed draft budget that rationalizes agency expenditures in the context of a well-communicated strategic plan, soliciting public comments on that draft with the board and a number of the agency's senior leaders present," end of quote. Based on feedback received from the briefings and comment letters, I am pleased to see that the final budget before us today is even slightly lower than the estimate in the draft published last month. This final budget proposal reflects a 1.7% decrease year over year, even with the planned mandatory increase in the required contribution for the Federal Employee Retirement System as dictated by OPM. This is the first decrease in the year-over-year budget since 2005, and I think it's a bold statement about our commitment to controlling costs to the credit union system. During this challenging time, credit unions are tightening their budgets in this environment, and NCUA must do the same and lead by example. Stakeholders should know that we do take the feedback seriously and work diligently to incorporate suggestions when possible to make the budget process and this final document stronger and, most importantly, more transparent. We also heard the feedback about taking a harder look at the 2022 budget and not to simply revert to old ways of doing business after the pandemic subsides, but rather to continue to find efficiencies in operations. After all, the pandemic has shown how the NCUA has been able to alter its ways of doing business and still protect the safety and soundness of the credit union system, its members, and the Share Insurance Fund. I think stakeholders will see that reflected in the 2022 budget, which is indeed a positive start, but we can always do more. I believe this year's budget is prudent and thoughtful for the upcoming year, one that balances many factors. It considers our missions, needs, our responsibility to safety and soundness. It considers the situation many credit unions are facing and having to be nimble and efficient. It makes it clear that responding to the COVID-19 pandemic is a priority of the agency. It further allows the agency to hire up to 30 retired examiners on a temporary basis if we need these resources because of the pandemic-induced economic downturn. And it considers ways that we can expand the important issue of financial inclusion through the advancing communities through credit, education, stability, and support, or simply known as access. I also believe that while the newly comprised NCRA board has the votes to remove the Consumer Compliance Program Officer position outright, in the spirit of bipartisanship, it remained in the budget and is intended to provide an additional resource to aid in developing a proposal to enhance consumer compliance examination procedures for the largest credit unions that are not primarily examined for consumer financial protection by the CFPB. This will be a temporary position with a term not to exceed 1 year unless a plan is adopted by the NCRA board. An additional existing NCRA staff member or person on detail from another government agency will be detailed to OCFP to support this project. The NCRA board must review any changes to consumer compliance functions and must affirmatively approve any such programs before implementation. This budget also moves the agency forward with FinTech. As many of you heard during my most recent congressional hearings, many of the other federal financial regulators have, or in some process or thereof, are establishing work units dedicated to FinTech initiatives. To address FinTech and access in the credit union industry, the NCUA will establish a dedicated, externally facing work unit with 2 new staff within the Office of the Executive Director that focuses on the practices and needs in the credit union system regarding FinTech. This is particularly important as the Director of Financial Technology and Access will provide input to OCIO and the Office of Business Innovation with respect to FinTech requirements necessary in the NCUA systems to support the exam and supervision program, as well as other ideas gleaned from innovation in the marketplace that could improve the operations of the agency. So again, Eugene, thank you and your team for your hard work in getting us here today. I now have just a few questions. As I mentioned, I believe this budget balances a number of factors. We go into 2021 facing many uncertainties about how COVID's economic situation will impact credit unions and the Share Insurance Fund. If the impact is more extreme, and we saw an increase in the number of troubled credit unions, conservatorships, and liquidations, what plans do we have in place to support an increase in agency workload?
Okay, thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. So I think the budget and our plans for 2021 contemplate this in several different ways. First is, I think I noted more extensively in the December 2nd presentation, the agency's prioritized hiring frontline examiner positions, and our vacancy rate headed into the end of this year and into next year is lower than it historically has been, with numerous hiring actions still underway to fill existing examiner vacancies. The Ncua, as I noted in my remarks, has approval from OPM to hire experienced retired examiners on a temporary basis, and the budget proposal, the BAM, contemplates up to 30 of those positions, which would be seasoned retired examiners or folks from Ncua coming into frontline examinations positions to help augment that workforce. The budget includes the whole budget process that we have at Ncua, as you know, has a mid-session reassessment in which we can take a look, and so if, like the scenario you suggested, things become, the workload increases more than what we projected, we've got various mechanisms to make adjustments and to reassess priorities as we work our way through the year. And it doesn't necessarily have to wait until the mid-year for the board to take action on those types of reassessments. The agency, I think, can also reassess and reprioritize within the overall funding structure the focus of the field staff and their workloads to be able to redirect staff to more pressing or urgent situations. And then I guess a final point I'd make, and one again we also talked about in the December 2nd meeting, is that the NCUA's model for credit union resolution generally is a model in which the costs are bared by the estates of the credit unions, of the troubled credit unions or liquidations, and ultimately borne more directly by the Share Insurance Fund and don't necessarily show up on the NCUA's operating budget. So those, I think, are some of the ways in which we've contemplated if we needed to flex up to respond to a more troubling situation like you suggest, that we would do that. Back to you, sir.
Great. Thank you, Eugene. You also mentioned the hiring of experienced retired examiners as needed using authority that the OPM has provided us. How many is the agency allowed to hire, and how would they be funded?
Yeah, thank you. So the authority is specific for up to 30 retired examiners. And what we would do, the way we would plan to fund that is after we've closed out the 2020 fiscal year and we've completed the audit for 2020 in the mid-February timeframe, we should have at that point a pretty good understanding if there are any surplus amounts left in the budget, particularly as it respects to payroll. Right now we're seeing a bit of a surplus in our payroll budget, which is just sort of a difference between when a vacancy occurs and how quick we can get the position filled. And so we're contemplating and asking for in the board action memorandum would be to use those surpluses, which I think makes sense because, again, these would be term positions, and so we could use leftover payroll money from 2020 to fund some of the term positions that would come on board under this temporary authority in 2021. That concludes my answer.
Thank you, Eugene. And I just have one final question, sir. The revised budget makes significant reductions to the 2022 portion of the budget proposal. Could you please tell me why that is prudent and what would typically happen as we approach 2022 with respect to the 2022 plan before us today?
Okay. So we took since we published the draft, and as you note, we've taken a significant reduction to the 22 estimate. We got a lot of comments. We heard them both at the meeting on December 2nd, as well as a lot of the written comments about the Ncua just sort of returning to a business as usual posture after the pandemic, and so that draft budget was projected to go up by 8.3% over the 2021 budget. So we went back and took a much more careful look at what our estimates were for 2022. A large portion of the increase that was kind of bouncing back in 2022 was associated with travel. As we've seen during the pandemic, most of the functions can still be performed through off-site examinations in remote work or off-site work. And the agency's made a commitment to the virtual exams program. And as I noted in my presentation, we get a number of comments about applauding and wanting Ncua to follow through on some of those commitments. So the 2022 draft budget had largely assumed kind of a return to normal for travel. And in light of how we've performed in 2020 and the lessons that we expect to take from that, we believe that the travel estimate could be reduced. We're also assuming a more typical, which means a higher vacancy rate in 2022 for the Ncua workforce. The workload models for 2022 suggest that we would require fewer hours than in 2021. While I think the 2022 plan is reasonable, it's built, like all budgets, on assumptions. And those assumptions may need to be changed as we approach 2022, particularly where the economy and the credit unions stand in terms of the economic recovery. So it's our practice at the Ncua board, and as before you today, it's a 2-year budget that we ask the Ncua board to adopt. As you know, our practice has been each year we reassess that upcoming year prior to its start. And so I'd expect that that would be the same for 2022, that we would reassess the funding levels to take into account new or revised priorities, updates in workload estimates, and other factors that might be pertinent for assessing the 2022 budget before it would take effect. And then all other things being equal, we'd go through a similar process as what we're doing this year prior to the start of 2022. That concludes my comment.
Great. Well, thank you, Eugene. I have no further questions. I, again, would like to thank you and ACVO for the yeoman's work you've done in getting today's budget proposal prepared. You guys are hardworking. You're the consummate professionals, and I want you to know that I greatly appreciate it and hope that you're still enjoying your new role as our newly minted CFO. So thank you for a job well done. I would now like to recognize Board Member Harper. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I fully agree with you about the outstanding work done by Eugene and his team in the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. They have spent a considerable amount of time and done yeoman's work in preparing the Ncua's budgets for 2021 and 2022. In my view, preserving the safety and soundness of the credit union system, protecting consumers, and preparing the Ncua for the economic fallout caused by the COVID-19 pandemic are nonpartisan issues. And from my perspective, there are a number of good things in this proposal, including devoting new resources to address financial technology, innovation, and access issues, providing funding to stand up a new Office of the Chief Ethics Counsel, and I should note that we just brought on board earlier this week our first Chief Ethics Counsel, and she is going to do a great job for us. Another good thing in this budget is completing the development and implementation of the modern examination and risk identification tool, otherwise known as MERIT, beginning work on a data collection and sharing solution, and dedicating funding for state examiner training. I also appreciate the hard work that went into balancing the requests of all 3 board offices. A budget, however, is a forward-looking document that establishes priorities. And while there are some positive aspects of this proposal, for me, this budget unfortunately falls short on several fronts. I will therefore oppose it. In light of the pandemic's economic effects, I have said that we should plan for the worst and hope for the best when budgeting for 2021. Once the effects of the economic stimulus fade and the congressionally imposed forbearance programs expire, we will have a fuller picture of the true state of the credit union system. The agency needs to prepare for that reality. The responsibility falls on the Ncua board to take a broad view of the state of the credit union system and adjust to that economic reality, including by modifying the policy governing examination scheduling when necessary. During prior economic downturns like the 2008 financial crisis, the Ncua returned to a 12-month examination cycle. Our sister agencies also increased their field resources to handle safety and soundness problems. Based on discussions with staff, I have concluded that we do not yet need to examine all federal credit unions on an annual basis. That is why I proposed a surgical approach to modifying our examination program as part of the budget negotiations. Specifically, we have identified a number of high-risk institutions for which we currently have no plans to examine in 2021. We know the risks are there, so we should plan to check in with these credit unions next year. Additionally, I called for the agency to examine all federally insured credit unions with $500 million more or in assets, regardless of charter type. When a federally insured credit union fails, the historical loss to the share insurance fund is about 20%. So a credit union with assets above $500 million would have the potential to cost the share insurance fund $100 million or more in losses. That is a sizable amount of money for the fund and surviving credit unions to absorb. In my view, it would be better to invest the resources to stay on top of any issues that come up at these credit unions. Under the surgical approach that I proposed, we would need 36 additional examiners in 2021. The 36 FTE figure represents conducting annual exams at those credit unions with $500 million more in assets and annual exams for credit unions identified as high risk for which there is currently not an exam scheduled in 2021. These exam program changes would provide the agency with the resources needed to be well prepared for what lies ahead. Earlier this week, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation approved its budget for 2021. That budget increased by 12.9%, a figure considerably higher than Ncua's proposed budget decrease of 1.7%. And the FDIC increased examiner and resolution staff to handle the problems ahead. We have a duty to credit union members and taxpayers to protect the share insurance fund and the credit union system. We have a duty to prepare for any economic fallout. We need to modify our examination program, and we need to increase our examiner ranks, at least on a temporary basis, to work through the anticipated problems. Regrettably, the budget before us falls short. It makes no changes to the exam scheduling policy, and authorizing the agency to fill 30 reemployed, re-annuitant positions is only an illusion. I am told that many of the potential rehires will not sign up for another term of service at the Ncua. And while I appreciate efforts to try to address this shortfall during the mid-session budget adjustments, we should be doing more sooner. If we cannot find enough reemployed annuitants to join our examiner ranks, we can find contractors to help fill out specialized roles on a short-term basis to free up trained examiners to focus on the biggest problems. That is an appropriate solution, but we are waiting too long to proceed with that option. Ultimately, I believe investing resources to stay on top of any issues that come up in the credit unions with high-risk profiles and in credit unions with more than $500 in assets, which each have the potential to cause $100 million or more in losses to the share insurance fund, should be a priority and should be in place at the start of the year. This budget falls short on that front. Additionally, we know that the Ncua falls short when it comes to the agency's oversight of consumer financial protection laws. Consumers, regardless of their financial provider of choice, deserve to have the same level of financial protection, yet we do not adequately assess consumer compliance management systems or even basic compliance with consumer financial protection laws in most credit unions. We also do not assign a separate consumer compliance rating in the way that other federal banking regulators and even some state credit union supervisors do. What is more, the credit union system has continued to grow and become more complex. We have 45 additional consumer credit unions holding in excess of $1 billion in assets than we did just 1 year ago. To build an effective consumer compliance supervisory program, the agency needs to do more than what the 2021 budget lays out. Adding just one term employee and a detailee for 1 year is simply not a strong enough commitment, in my view. The budget also authorizes a report that is due on October 15th, which is an arbitrary and short amount of time to produce a document that will ostensibly, quote, provide options regarding the enhanced procedures and the cohort of credit unions that would be subject to them, unquote. The report would include associated considerations and cost estimates for each option identified, a summary of results from any pilot testing of examination procedures, and a recommendation for the options identified in the report from the directors of several Ncua offices in each of the regions. Notably, staff will also seek the views of state supervisory authorities in developing recommendations. This is too much work for just a one-term employee and one detailee to accomplish. To better safeguard consumers' interests and ensure the credit union system lives up to its commitment to serving its members, it has been my long-standing position that we need to provide at least 3 permanent full-time employees in the Office of Consumer Financial Protection to begin the development of a dedicated, standalone federal consumer financial protection compliance examination program for large, complex credit unions. Anything short of that is a disservice to credit union members. On another note, I very much understand the need to house expertise within the agency related to financial innovation, technology, and access. My original concern with the creation of another standalone office, so I was pleased when we instead decided to house the small group as a division within the Office of the Executive Director. But I do not support moving the virtual exam program to this division. That function is best kept with the Office of Examination and Insurance. The budget we are considering today also moves the Central Liquidity Facility from the Office of Examination and Insurance. From my perspective, housing the facility within the Office of Examination and Insurance has worked well, and I do not believe that it needs to be moved. I am also not sold on the idea of having a standalone office. We need further study about where the Central Liquidity Facility would best fit to ensure that our resources are efficiently used. Like the chairman, I am also deeply committed to doing what is right for credit union members, the agency and its employees, the Share Insurance Fund, and the credit union system. I also know that if we take the time and work together, we can identify a mutually agreeable initiative that addresses the concerns of everyone, including advancing economic equality and justice, which is broader than the Access Initiative. We must act to close the wealth gap, support minority and depository institutions with more resources, and ensure compliance with fair lending laws so that people of all colors can buy a home, purchase a car, or finance college without being subject to discriminatory terms. In doing so, we will lift all boats and live up to the cooperative philosophy at the heart of the credit union movement. Although we are passing this budget today without having taken the steps needed to build out a more comprehensive program, I am hopeful that we can work to find common ground in the next year. Finally, the funding in the amount of $300,000 has been added to this budget to develop and implement an examination survey program to get feedback from credit unions on their interactions with the agency. The Ncua previously had an exam feedback program, but that program received few responses and was ultimately ended because it was cost inefficient. I look forward to seeing whether this time around we can develop and deliver a better product. Ultimately, given my concerns about exam preparedness, consumer financial protection, and other matters, I cannot support the 2021 budget as presented. Again, I appreciate the very hard work of staff and the efforts to improve the original draft. But in the end, this budget falls short of my expectations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no further comments.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. I just, though, would like to note that the CLF is a standalone entity that also reports to the board under the delegations of authority. I'd now like to recognize Board Member Hauptman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to Eugene, that was a great presentation. I concur with the other board members that you did a lot of work on this. And I also want to give credit to all the Ncua employees at the end of a very difficult year. And the credit is for finding new ways to do things this year as part of this sort of global experiment in doing things a different way. And I concur with the sentiment that we can reduce travel expenses even when we go back to the so-called normal times, because we've learned from the experiments we've done this year. We don't want to keep everything the way it was this year, but there are things we've learned that will allow us to give more attention to those troubled credit unions and do so for less money. Even the slight decrease in this year's budget is quite remarkable. You rarely see that from a government agency, but you do see it all the time in the private sector, the people we work for. What this means is Ncua is doing what credit unions do every single day. That is providing their services at more and more attractive prices. We know from the lead up to the financial crisis and what happened afterwards, there was very little correlation between the amount of regulators enforcing a certain number of regulations and how those entities actually performed in a crisis. What adding more does, adding more power in Washington, more resources in Washington, always does is increase the safety and stability of the region I live in. I don't know if it necessarily always yields the results that its proponents might wish for. But it is one of the reasons the suburbs surrounding D.C. are one of the wealthiest in the country, despite a city that produces very few marketable products of any real value. We manage to grow and have nice lives here, not like everybody else does. Everybody else has to go in the open market and earn it. We can just demand money from hardworking people and say we're going to spend it better than they will. Sometimes that may be true, and you have to have regulation. But given the season we're in, I just want to say that we should note every dollar we take is obviously the money of credit union members. Every bit we spend could be food on some family's table. It could be a birthday present for a kid that doesn't have much, or a bus ticket to go see a sick relative for the final time. We need to be able to look them in the eye and tell them that what we spent was worth it. I will be supporting the budget, but I do look forward to working with the other board members on ideas to get flexibility, to be able to do more with less so we can add to the areas where we would like to expand our abilities. Regarding the $300K for the feedback survey, it is my understanding that we'll put together a plan, or I hope to, that will be fundamentally different than it was before. I concur that prior efforts did not yield many positive results. I have no further comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hauptman, and I want you to know that I look forward to working together with you in partnership in the many years to come. With that being said, regarding the survey, I know that that was an area that you were able to opine in as it relates to this year's budget. The survey has been done internally in the past here at the agency, but I think that doing something with an external group that's been tested and proven, and it's a private sector best practice. I mean, there are times you need to go with industry leaders when it comes to getting the feedback that we want. So with that being said, I think since we've done this survey before, but now we're doing it externally, and I think it'll be more robust and will give us some really opportunities to glean insight. So thank you for that recommendation. With that being said, I'd now like to ask, is there a motion on the 2022 budget?
Yes, this is Board Member Houghton. I move that the board approve, and this is quite a bit to say here. I move that the board approve, number one, the 2021 operating budget of $314,560,000 and 1,187 full-time employees, and the 2022 operating budget of $316,890,000 and 1,182 full-time employees. Second, the 2021 capital budget of $18,845,000 and the 2022 capital budget for the same amount. Number three, the 2021 Share Insurance Fund administrative budget of $7,972,000 and 5 full-time employees, and the 2022 Share Insurance Fund administrative budget of $7,755,000 and 5 full-time employees. Fourth, the requirements discussed in the provisions for the 2021-2022 budget section of this memorandum. Fifth, that the $3,700,000 from the unspent 2020 travel balances is available for payment of the central office note in 2020. Six, that $6,700,000 from unspent 2020 travel balances is available for expenditure in 2021 from the operating fund for travel and pandemic-related expenses. Seventh, that unspent 2020 operating budget funding shall be available for expenditure in 2021 from the operating fund for employees hired using the temporary COVID-19 hiring authority as described in this memorandum, and use of this authority is delegated to the executive director. Eighth, that delegation HR 1C is amended to include the Director of Financial Technology and Access. Ninth and final, an extension through December 31st, 2021 of the availability for expenditure of previously approved reorganization funds, and an extension through December 31, 2021 of the Executive Director's authority to reallocate such organization funds, all as detailed in the Board Action Memorandum. I have concluded.
Is there a second to the motion? Hearing none, I will second the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay.
Nay.
The ayes have it, and let the record show the motion passed 2-1. Thank you again, Eugene, for your hard work, and please thank OCFO as well. The third and final item on our agenda today is board briefing. It's a briefing regarding the Ncra operating fee schedule and overhead transfer rate. This is a companion item to both the revised operating fee regulation we discussed and the 2021-22 budget. The Ncra published in the Federal Register our overhead transfer rate methodology and proposed changes to the methodology used in calculating the operating fee paid by federal credit unions. Staff presenting: Eugene Shead, Chief Financial Officer; James Holm, Budget Analyst, Office of the Chief Financial Officer; Vicki Norwell, Acting Associate Director, Office of Examinations and Insurance; and Ian Morena, Associate General Counsel, Office of the General Counsel. Good morning, all of you, and welcome. And Eugene, you get to stay in place, I gather. So you all are welcome in.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Eugene Shead, and good morning again, Chairman Hood, Board Member Harper, and Board Member Hopman. As the Chairman just noted, in July 2020, the Ncua Board approved the issuance of a notice to request comments on two matters. The first related to the request for comments on the existing principles-based overhead transfer rate, or OTR, methodology adopted in 2017. No changes were proposed to the existing methodology. The publication continued the commitment to seek public comment on the OTR methodology every 3 years, and in the event it proposes changes on one or more of the principles. The second matter was a request for comment on proposed clarifications to and questions about the operating fee methodology, which is used to determine how the Ncua apportions operating fees charged to federal credit unions. Subject to the Board's approval at the conclusion of this presentation, the Ncua would publish a final notice on the existing OTR methodology and the Ncua operating fee schedule methodology as attached in the Board Action Memorandum. Let me now turn to Vicki Narwald, Acting Associate Director, Office of Examinations and Insurance, who will discuss the OTR methodology and the agency's response to the comments it received. Vicki.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Hood, Board Member Harper, and Board Member Hoffman. In response to the notice and request for comment that Eugene discussed, the Ncua received 8 comment letters about the OTR methodology and the operating fee methodology. My colleagues from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer will discuss the comment letters on the operating fee methodology. I will address the OTR comments. The comments we received on the OTR generally supported transparency, fair and equitable allocation of expenses, and prudent management of the Ncua's budget. Since the Board did not propose any changes to the OTR methodology this year, the request for comments on the OTR focused on the 4 principles that comprise the OTR methodology. We received comments on the 4 principles, but we also received broader-based comments on the NCUA's transparency and the industry's need for an OTR methodology that provides for a fair and equitable distribution of expenses among federally insured credit unions. Commenters requested clarification and additional transparency in the OTR methodology, particularly in the distinction between NCUA's role as regulator versus insurer. For instance, in recent years, annual reports from the Office of Examination and Insurance to the board on the OTR have referenced the FDIC's alternating exam cycle as a method of describing the split between NCUA's role as regulator versus insurer and the NCUA's decision to use the 50% allocation factor applied to the supervision and examination of federal credit unions. There was some confusion about the NCUA comparing the split between its dual roles to that of the FDIC's alternating exam cycle with state regulators. Unlike the FDIC's alternating exam cycle, there is not a clear separation between NCUA's role as regulator versus insurer in either duty or function. As a result, there was a request for more transparency around this distinction and how it affects the allocation factor for federal credit unions. Likewise, there was a question how an alternating exam program could potentially lower the budgeted costs of supervising federally insured state credit unions. There was also emphasis among commenters on the NCUA adopting a model that establishes a fair and equitable distribution of expenses between federal credit unions and federally insured state credit unions. Multiple commenters thought establishing a working group or advisory committee consisting of both the NCUA and state regulators would improve the OTR process by providing a way to develop a fair and equitable distribution of insurance-related costs. The comments on the allocation factors, other than the examination and supervision of federal and state chartered credit unions that I have already discussed, focused on the percentages referenced as insurance-related in the methodology. The commenters were focused more on the examination aspect of these functions and thus may not have understood the allocation factors we use in the methodology that also involve functions other than examination and supervision. For example, the All Other Offices category carries a blended percentage allocation because these offices provide direct support to the exam function as well as other offices not involved in the exam function. The 0% allocation for chartering and enforcing consumer protection is 0% because the NCUA central offices that oversee these functions do not directly support the examination and supervision of federally insured credit unions. Further, the time associated with overseeing compliance with consumer laws and regulations is already included in the respective allocations for examination and supervision of federally insured credit unions. Third-party vendors and credit union service organizations, on the other hand, have a 100% allocation because NCUA does not regulate these entities. Therefore, NCUA conducts its review as the insurer of credit union deposits. This concludes a summary of the majority of comments received and my remarks. The NCUA responds to comments in the overhead transfer rate methodology and operating fee schedule methodology final notice. I will now turn the presentation over to Jim Holm, Supervisory Budget Analyst with the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, to discuss the response to the request for comment on the operating fee methodology. Jim?
Thank you, Vicki, and hello again, Chairman Hood and board members Harper and Hauptman. In its July notice, the NCUA board described and requested comments on 3 proposed changes to the methodology it uses to determine how the agency apportions operating fees charged to federal credit unions, or FCUs. The board uses operating fees collected from FCUs to fund the part of the NCUA's annual budget that is not paid through the OTR. In particular, the board proposed 1, clarifying the treatment of capital project budgets when calculating the operating fees, 2, clarifying the treatment of miscellaneous revenues when calculating the operating fees, and 3, modifying the approach for calculating the annual inflationary adjustments to the thresholds for the operating fee rate tiers. The board also solicited comment on adjusting the asset sizes that establish the boundaries of the operating fee rate tiers, increasing the current 1 million asset size threshold below which an FCU pays no operating fee, and also asked about approaches to incentivizing FCUs and federally insured state charter credit unions, or FISCUs, to complete an annual voluntary diversity self-assessment. In response to the proposed change to the treatment of capital project budgets for calculating the operating fee, none of the 8 commenters objected. This change would include capital budget amounts in the total budget against which the OTR is applied, thereby collecting the OTR share of capital projects at the time such expenditures occur. One commenter recommended that the costs of capital projects whose benefits accrue solely to the NCUA should not be subject to the OTR, and provided as an example the fact that the agency will discontinue its SIF computer lease program for state supervisory authorities after 2021, meaning that capital project funds will be used to provide computers only to NCUA employees. While it's factually true that the NCUA will discontinue its SIF computer lease program for state supervisory authorities in 2022, the agency believes this example misstates the purpose of applying the OTR to the capital budget. The computed OTR is an estimate of the share of the NCUA's work that relates to its role as an insurer. As a result, even though some capital projects, such as the agency's computer lease program, will only be for NCUA employees in the future, it is still appropriate to apply the OTR to such project costs, since the purpose of the OTR is to pay for the insurance-related share of the NCUA's budget via reimbursement from the SIF. In response to the proposed change to the treatment of miscellaneous revenues when calculating the operating fee, none of the 8 commenters objected. The NCUA's miscellaneous revenues include revenues from the production and sale of NCUA reports and publications, rent collected from other federal agencies that share NCUA facilities, and parking fee revenues. By including miscellaneous revenues in the annual budget total against which the OTR is applied, FCUs and FISCUs would share any revenue collected by the agency at the same ratio that they share expenses. Therefore, accounting in this way for the miscellaneous revenues is consistent with the proposed change to the treatment of capital project budgets, inasmuch as it reflects an equitable distribution of the agency's net expenses between FCUs and FISCUs. The board also proposed making other conforming changes to how it calculates annual inflationary adjustments to operating fee rate tier thresholds for consistency with proposed changes to its regulation governing assessment of the annual operating fee. No commenters objected to these largely technical changes. Because the public comments about the board's proposed changes to the operating fee methodology were generally supportive, staff recommend that the board adopt the proposed new methodology without further revisions. The request for comment also sought views about how or whether the board should modify the current 3-tier operating fee schedule, and how or whether the board should increase the asset threshold below which FCUs are assessed no operating fee. We also asked the public for their views on what incentives the board might provide to encourage credit union participation in the annual voluntary diversity self-assessment. Commenters who provided views about modification of the 3-tier operating fee schedule primarily requested that the agency develop any such modifications in a transparent manner that allows for adequate time for public review and comment. There were no specific or substantive recommendations about how changes to the tiers might result in a more equitable distribution of costs among the FCUs that pay the operating fees. As a result, the staff recommends further review and study of the three-tier operating fee schedule, specifically evaluating whether changes to the credit union system since the last time the tiers were modified may have impacted the equitable distribution of operating fee costs. Responses to the other two questions asked by the board regarding the operating fee exemption threshold and potential incentives for completing the voluntary diversity self-assessment provided no clear consensus of views. There were multiple different exemption thresholds suggested by commenters. Several commenters who supported incentives for completing the voluntary diversity self-assessment noted that both FCUs and FISCUs should receive the same and equitable treatment, while other commenters opposed any incentives whatsoever. As a result, staff recommend that concurrent with the study of the operating fee rate tiers, the agency should further review the impact of changing the exemption threshold and should also work to develop more concrete options for incentives for participating in the voluntary diversity self-assessment. This concludes my remarks, and at this time, my colleagues and I would be happy to answer any questions that you all may have. Back to you, Chairman Hood.
Great. Well, thank you all for your very thoughtful presentation this morning. Seeking comment on these methodologies that are critical to funding the Ncra budget is part of our overall commitment to transparency in the Ncra's budgeting and financial management practices. Not only did we publish our methodologies and some proposed changes, the notice also sought stakeholder input on several proposals and questions intended to improve how operating fees are assessed. So now, everyone, I do have a few quick questions for you. First, I think this would probably be directed to you, Eugene. You just presented the Ncra budget for 2021-2022. What impact does the methodology have on the budget?
So the methodology that we're talking about in the changes really has no real material impact on the budget. Rather, the methodology goes to the heart of how we spread that portion of the budget that will be funded through the operating fee across the federal credit union community. And so really it's a question that it gets at how we allocate those fees across that spectrum of the federal credit unions and doesn't change anything with the budget calculations. Back to you, sir.
Great, thank you. And Vicki, this may be a good question for you. I understand that there were no proposed changes to the OTR methodology. Could you please explain the process for how the Ncra will respond to commenters?
Thank you, Chairman Hood. This is Vicki. I'll be happy to answer that. So the Ncua, following this meeting, will submit a final notice on the overhead transfer rate methodology and the operating fee schedule methodology to the Federal Register. And this final notice will provide a detailed account of the request for comment, the comment letters received, and Ncua's response. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki. In the notice for comment, we solicited feedback on some more open-ended questions regarding the application of the operating fee, such as raising the minimum threshold for those that pay the fee and whether we can develop some financial incentive for credit unions to participate in the diversity self-assessment. And Jim, this may be a question for you. Could you please elaborate a bit more on the feedback we received and what next steps staff might take with respect to these particular questions?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. As you explained, we did ask for public views about three different matters, and so let me summarize briefly the comments or the responses to each of those three questions and what our planned next steps are. So for the first question, that was a question about whether credit unions could give us any specific views or recommendations about the structure of the operating fee rate schedule. So just to explain briefly, the current operating fee schedule is regressive. That is, for the three rate tiers, those credit unions with more assets pay lower marginal rates on the assets that fall into the higher tiers. And so we asked whether credit unions would support alternatives to that regressive rate structure, such as perhaps a flat fee, flat rate that all credit unions would pay evenly on all assets, or a more progressive structure that would apply a higher marginal rate to assets that fall into the higher tiers. We only received, well, of the 8 comment letters we received about the operating fee methodology, only 2 of the respondents actually addressed this question in their responses. Both of them asked for additional and more transparent data analysis, and so therefore we recommend developing this analysis of various options we might consider and engaging the public again in the future once we have that data available. The second question that we asked was whether the credit union industry would support increasing the exemption threshold, which is the level below which federal credit unions do not have to pay the operating fee. Currently, the federal credit unions that have $1 million or less in assets are exempt from paying an operating fee. Of the 8 response letters we received, 5 respondents addressed the question. And of that 5, 3 supported increasing the exemption threshold to $10 million. 1 respondent recommended keeping the threshold unchanged at the current $1 million. And then 1 commenter offered no opinion in particular about what the threshold level should be, but that commenter stated that the Ncua budget should be reduced by the amount of foregone revenue that would result from modifying the exemption threshold and increasing it to whatever the new level would be. So since there was no real consensus of opinion about the exemption threshold, we recommend further analysis of this issue as well, and presenting options about different thresholds that we might adopt as part of the review of the operating fee rate tier structure. So in the future, we can present those options along with our analysis, present that to the public, and explain what changes we might recommend to the exemption threshold. The third question we asked was to receive public comment about or suggestions about how we might sufficiently incentivize participation in the voluntary credit union self-assessment. And I believe Monica Davey, the director of OMWI, briefed the Ncua board about that self-assessment last month. So of the 8 respondents, we received 6 answers to that question. 5 of the 6 supported incentives, provided that they can provided that those incentives would apply equally to both federally chartered and the federally insured state chartered credit unions. 1 of the respondents opposed incentives. So our initial suggestion was to offer a discount on the operating fee as an incentive for participation in the voluntary self-assessment. But from the comments we received, we realized that that type of incentive would only apply to federal credit unions and would therefore not meet the feedback we received from the commenters who argued the incentive should apply equally for federally chartered and for also federally insured state chartered credit unions. So in order to treat the FCUs and FISCUs equitably, we recommend further analysis of the types of incentives we might provide, regardless of their chartering status. And therefore, we would include that in the analysis we do about the rates and the rate tiers, as well as the exemption threshold, and plan to get back with public notice at a future date. So thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. I hope that answers what you were asking, and I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Jim, and it certainly does answer everything I was asking. I appreciate that very detailed response. I have no further questions. I'd now like to recognize Board Member Harper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Eugene, Jim, Vicki, and Ian, for your presentation on the publication of a final notice in the Federal Register related to the methodologies the Ncua uses to determine the overhead transfer rate and the operating fee schedule. In July, the Ncua board invited comment on the way by which the Ncua determines the overhead transfer rate. We also requested comment on the procedures used to determine the operating fees paid by federal credit unions. This final notice responds to the comments received on both matters, as well as on 3 other subjects on which we sought input. I would like to focus on those 3 other subjects. With respect to the operating fee, we have the authority under the Federal Credit Union Act to consider the ability of federal credit unions to pay the fee. In recent years, we have exempted the smallest of federal credit unions, those with total assets of $1 million or less, from the fee. Because the system's total assets have grown considerably since 2013, when we implemented the last threshold change, I believe it makes sense to consider a higher threshold. That said, stakeholders did not reach a consensus about this matter in their comments. As I also said in July, I have long had concerns about the regressive nature of the operating fee schedule. Smaller credit unions end up paying more for oversight and regulation than larger credit unions in that they pay higher marginal rates for their assets in the lower tiers. We need to do more to support the work of small credit unions, and altering the structure for assessing the operating fee would help in this regard. On this point, none of the stakeholders making comments provided specific recommendations for how to revise the operating fee structure, but some of the respondents recommended following a fully transparent process for developing a new operating fee schedule. This is an appropriate path for us to explore. As the amount of examination time has been increasing at larger credit unions compared to smaller credit unions in recent years, I believe it is appropriate for us to consider modifying the operating fee structure to establish a flat rate or even a progressive fee structure so that we do not penalize credit unions simply for being smaller. Small credit unions already have enough issues to deal with and keep their doors open. We should find ways to give them a break. Finally, the Ncua board asked stakeholders whether we could offer some incentive to credit unions to complete the voluntary annual diversity self-assessment called for in the Dodd-Frank, Wall Street Reform, and Consumer Financial Protection Act. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are vitally important to the future of the credit union system, and they help to ensure that the credit union system remains focused on fulfilling the mission of providing thrift to people of modest means. While there was no consensus about how to proceed in providing such an incentive, I agree with the commenters who suggested that there should be parity between federal credit unions and federally insured state-chartered credit unions for any incentive program. As we move into 2021, Ncua staff should further explore these three issues by conducting more analysis and developing recommendations for the board for action on the operating fee threshold, the operating fee schedule, and incentives to encourage participation in the voluntary diversity self-assessment. In closing, Mr. Chairman, I will support publishing this Federal Register final notice about the methodologies used for determining the overhead transfer rate and the operating fee schedule. I have nothing further to add at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. I'd now like to recognize Board Member Hauptman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do not have much comments on the topic in question, but I would like to add, if I may, a brief digression because we have talked about the diversity survey a bit in this segment. The diversity survey, I think, is a good example of what we could do well in a feedback loop. And let me just spec out the example here for you. As you know from the trade press and from the lobbying groups and from credit unions themselves, there's some concern over the diversity inclusion survey. And the concern is, even though Ncua says, sincerely, no, we're just collecting data, there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer, we're just trying to see what's going on. We just want to get your answers. The industry says, well, we're concerned that there's going to be right answers and wrong answers. Is there going to be pressure to fill out the survey? Is there going to be pressure based on what the survey says if we do fill it out? Well, imagine, if you will, at the conclusion of an exam, the exam was not finished until, at the bottom there's, say, 3 questions. And these questions would change over time, and they would be suggested by Ncua staff and by credit union members themselves. And they would change with the times, depending on what was pertinent. But let's say the exam was not over. There was a little piece that was sent back to the board, and it said, point blank, was the diversity survey ever mentioned, or the diversity characteristics of the credit union staff ever mentioned or brought up? Have you ever felt any pressure from anybody at Ncua regarding those matters. Knowing that that was there, kind of like how, you can't even order an Uber until you rate the last ride, meaning that ride isn't completed until all parties rate each other, right? It's similar to the way that good police, which, I think we believe is the majority of them, very much welcome body cameras. It makes their jobs much easier. And as does the public that they serve, right? Why have disputes over what was said? And you shouldn't have a credit union feel that they're, harming the relationship by addressing something with their regulator. So if everybody in the room knows that that question about the diversity survey is going to be asked point blank at the end, and those results are going to be sent to us in DC, and perhaps the examiner would fill out the same 3 questions. Did you ever mention anything, right? That would, I think, boost confidence in it. It would boost the survey results, and it would boost the intention of things like that. But you could address it as well. I know from my time on the Hill, one example would be flood insurance, where there was it's an incredibly boring, arcane topic, but the examiners had a much easier time certifying that a property had required flood insurance if they used the government's flood insurance. There's a thing called NFIP. There's private insurance that works perfectly well, that is certified, that meets the standards, but it's a little bit more work for the examiner to ascertain whether or not it meets the standards. Over and over and over again, we hear that because it's easier for the examiners, the public flood insurance was favored. And it could be a lack of communication with the examiner, that they're willing to do the extra work. But had there been a question, was private flood insurance treated equitably to the government insurance? And everybody in the room knew that when we were done, that had to be filled out or the exam wasn't over. That would be one example, and I've gotten terrific reception when we've addressed this with examined institutions, not to mention the private flood insurance industry. So you had people getting worse insurance. The government insurance policy is very clunky. At higher prices, families' finances were being hurt, all because there wasn't this feedback survey. And it wasn't the sort of thing where the institution would want to raise their hand and complain about. First of all, the institution themselves wasn't necessarily penalized in this because of the higher price insurance. That was their customer who had the mortgage. So you had a situation going on, and there wasn't a proper feedback loop. And if everybody knew that that was going to be asked, I think we would have had much, much better results, and there would be just an exhale of welcome clarity and certainty to the process. So again, we've seen in the press about the diversity survey. It's just an example that happens to be on the table right now of, well, what's going to happen? Is this going to be used against us? You can address that point blank and I think put some minds at ease. So none of these institutions would be the one putting their hand up. They wouldn't have to go through a lobbyist. They're not the one complaining. They didn't put their head above the tree line. This is just normal part of it, the same way that the reason we get much better service in Uber and Lyft and taxis, not because the human beings are different. We're the same passengers, and some of the Uber and Lyft drivers used to be taxi drivers. They're the same people. The only difference is we both rate each other at the end. So there's an incentive. It's just human nature. So I do think we would get an excellent reaction from credit unions, provided we work with Ncua staff and the credit union members to determine what should be listed at the end on this quick bit at the end that everybody filled out to conclude their survey. And they would obviously change over time. I have no further comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Haltman. Is there a motion?
Yes, this is Board Member Harper. I move that the board issue a final notice on the existing OTR methodology and the Ncua operating fee schedule methodology as attached to the board action memorandum.
Is there a second to the motion?
Board Member Hauptman, I second the motion.
There is a sufficient second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and let the record show the motion passed 3-0. Thank you all. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of our agenda for today for the public board meeting. There being no further business in open session, we are hereby adjourned, but I would like to wish all of you a wonderful and happy and safe holiday season with your families. I look forward to seeing you all and speaking with you all again in the new year. Bless you all. This meeting is adjourned.